All right, so we're back. This time we're going to go through the effects fill section of Metron. So I'd say the effects fill page is one of my most favorite sections of Metron. During live performances, I like to set up my variations, and then I'll just go into this page and hang out there. I've got my mutes, my rolls, my loops, and I've also got manual gates that I can just play and also audition stuff to make sure that I know what track is what. So we're just going to dive into it. The first track laid out here is mutes. So I'm going to bring up my pattern here. We can see that this is my pattern. So we've got tracks laid out 1 through 16 on the top here, and you can see here this little label reminds you that these are mutes. So we can mute our kick drum, and we can mute our claps, and then we can bring them back in. So you can mute any channels here, and then bring them back in. So super useful, you know, the king of techno is to drop the kick drum out and bring it back in, right? So we made that as easy as possible. Another really cool thing you can do with mutes is set up mute scenes. So right now, every scene is set up to be all tracks on. That's just how by default it is. Individual track button number 1 is your mute scene button. So you're going to want to hold this, and then you press any one of the mutes, and this is going to bring up a scene. So right now, what I mean by all tracks on is if I hit any of these buttons, it's just going to turn all the tracks back on. So to set up a custom mute scene, all we need to do is go through and mute the things we want to mute. So I've got these 3 things here. And let's say I want to make this mute scene number 2, because I really like number 1 to be all tracks on. So I'm just going to hold step button 2 and hit the mute and then hit the mute scene button. This has now said that mute scene 2 is going to always pull up like this, and then mute scene 1 is all tracks on. So as you can see, got all tracks on. I just hold this button here and I hit step 2, and now I've got this mute scene up. So very useful for things you want to recall and switch in between. If you have a track that you want to not be a part of a mute scene, you want it to just be safe from that scene, meaning that if you toggle on or off, nothing happens to this track. You can enable certain tracks to be a part of it or not. These 2 buttons are basically our enable buttons for the whole section. So what we're going to do is, let's just say I want number 7 to be on no matter what, or I just want it to be safe from the mute scene. So I'm going to hold my track enable here, and which is either 2 or 3, either track buttons 2 or 3. Those are our enable buttons. So I'm going to hit number 2 and hit 7. Now 7s can't be a part of any scene. So even if I set it up here and say I want 7 to be off, and I say make that track 2, if I go to track 1, or sorry, if I go to mute scene 1 now, 7 was not affected. So if I turn 7 on, remember how it was a part of mute scene number 2 and it should turn off? It's not going to turn off. So this is completely independent of the mute scenes. So again, if we want to enable that on or off, we just hold either track 2 or 3 button, which is our track enable button. And you can see in the current step window, it says enable here. Up here it says scene. If I hit number 1, it says scene. If I hit 2 or 3, it says enable. That's just to remind you what these buttons do. And then the last button is a latch mode. We'll get into that in just a second. So I'm going to go through here and enable, turn my track 7 back off from enable. I like it there. And we'll hit track button 2, or mute scene number 2, that mutes that. Go back to mute scene number 1, that brings all of them back. So super useful performance tools. The second row is rolls, as you can see here by this label. So what rolls do is they're either straight rolls. We got quarter note, 8th note, 16th note, and 32nd notes. Then we have user patterns here, 1 through 4. And then we've got triplet grid, quarter note triplets, 8th note triplets, 16th note triplets, and 32nd note triplets. And then these are all patterns, user patterns again. And by default, these are all on the triplet grid. Also, right now, all tracks are enabled to be a part of this roll. So if I hit the 8th note roll, all tracks are going to fire at 8th notes, 16th notes, 32nd notes. So the user patterns right now have a couple default patterns in there, so you just hold these. And we think these are pretty useful for doing fills and stuff during live performance. If you want to change your own, if you want to set your own, you can. I'll show you how to do that in just a second. But before we do that, we're going to set up our fills to only affect certain tracks. So to do that, we're going to hold our enable buttons. Remember, 2 or 3 are our enable buttons. We can see enable here. And I'm just going to go through here and say I only want the fill to affect my clap. So I'm going to turn off every track except for track 7, which is my clap. Now, any fill that I hit is just going to affect the clap. So that's super fun. I can do my user fills here. And you can see that this is bright, letting me know that that's going to be the main track that gets affected. So I've got this triplet. And so you can have that affect any track just by going through here and tapping which track you'd like. So if you want to solo an instrument like I just did, like we're just only going to use the claps, we can actually hold our enable button and then just hold the track that you want to enable. And if you hold it for long enough, all tracks will just snap to that. Everything else will turn off. So it's a really fast way to do enables. You can see, just going to hold it here, and you can move your enables around. So that's a really fast way to move your main enable. So to go even one deeper, we have the roll pattern special track enable. So this means you can make these fills have a special track assigned to them, so that way you aren't always locked to this one track, right? So to show you what I mean, I'm going to bring in the bass line, and we're going to say that all of these user fills here, these ones, we only want to affect the bass line. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold the fill button and we're going to hit the enable button. Now this brings up another page here where these are all flashing. If the LEDs are all flashing like this means that the fill that you just went in to assign a special track to does not have a special track enabled to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to say I just want it to be track 13, which is the step input to the Architect. I can hit enable again to get out, and you can see this button is bright but just a little bit less bright than this LED, telling you what your main enable is. So now when I press this button, I'm only affecting the Architect track. And then the rest of the buttons still have to do with my track, or with my clap track. Let's just do something a little bit more obvious there. We'll do it with the hi-hat, because the hi-hat is a little bit more obvious. So for our special track enable, I'm just going to press this fill again, and I'll press our enable button. That brings us into here. I can turn off the special track enable. That means it'll adhere to the master track. But what I want to do is I want it to be our open hi-hat. So I'm just going to say track number 4. Go back out. Now when I hit this button, we're going to get fills on the open hi-hat. And then this one is going to be our clap still, which I have muted over here on the mixer. You can mix and match rolls and fills and do a bunch of different crazy stuff. You can have, each fill can have a different track if that's something you're going for. I think it's really useful to use with the Architect, because then you can throw some cool fills on the Architect. But really anything you're going for, that's what roll is all about. All right, so one more thing about the roll feature is that if you want to make your own custom fill, you totally can. And you can replace anything that we've made. We made some pretty useful things, we think, but if you want to make your own, you totally can. So just to show you how to do that, here's our pattern. What you need to do is you just go into any track and make the pattern that you want to be your fill. So I'm just going to make this pattern here on my claps, and I'm going to add some bursts in here. And this is the pattern that I want to save to my fill. So how we're going to do that is we're going to hold the track that we're working with. So I'm just going to hold track number 3, or track number 7 that is. And then I'm going to hit effects fill. While I'm still holding this enable button, or this track button, it goes into P1. You can see that this is my pattern 1 here. So I can scroll through and I can save on P1 all the way through P8. And if I really want to, I can actually replace the things that we've designated as your quarter note slot and your eighth note slot and your triplet slots. But for now, I'm just going to go through and I'm going to say I want this to be on P1. So I'm going to hit my encoder 1. That saves it. We go back to the main view. Now I'm just going to clear out my clap track, go into fill effect, and on P1 we'll now hear the fill that I just recorded. To move on, now we're going to go through loop. So the loop function is exactly what it sounds like. You can loop a certain amount of steps, and when you let go of the effect, it's just going to keep playing as if you never triggered a loop. So you can't mess up your sequence or make anything jarring. You just make the loop happen, and then when you let go, the sequence continues as if nothing ever happened. So to show you what I mean, we're just going to say let's bring our architect back in. So as you can see, the buttons are now laid out in how many steps you're going to loop. So I want to loop 4 steps, so I just press step number 4. I want to do 3 steps, 2, and then 1 step. And when I let go, the sequence just continues as if I didn't have any loop go on. So you can't mess anything up, which is really awesome. If you want to enable only certain tracks to adhere to the loop, just hold your enable again, and you can do that. So we can turn off certain tracks, turn on certain tracks, and now when I press the 3 loop button, it's only going to be certain tracks, like I turned the kick drum off, so the kick drum's rolling through here. And as you can see by these LEDs, these are telling me what tracks are enabled. The loop feature does not have a special track enable, it's just the master track enable. It's also super useful just to leave all of the tracks on, because now we've got more of a beat repeat kind of thing where we can just say, and we're looping the whole thing and we're getting more of a stutter effect. Alright, so the last section in the effects fill page is the manual gates function. So manual gates are super fun because you can play stuff in. And then they're also really helpful just to remind yourself of what track is what, right? So I can't remember what hi-hat track is, so I just go through, oh, there it is, that's my hi-hat track. So now anything I want to have happen to the hi-hat track, that's track 4. So it's a good place to audition stuff. We've talked about mute scenes, we've talked about the enables here. The last button on the individual track buttons is a latch feature. So if you want to latch any of these effects on, you just hold this button and then hit the effect. So we're going to just latch it to be a 4-step loop right here. And now it's latched, it's going to stay on that 4-step loop until we tell it to leave. So we can say go on a 3-step loop. And the latch feature works either way. You can be holding an effect and then hit latch, or you can just hold latch and then hit the button. This also works with your loops and fills. So the latch feature is really useful if you want to loop something and then move to like a different variation, or like get something done, you go back, turn it off. You can also record pretty much any action here except for the mutes. So if you're in effects fill page, just hit record. Now record is enabled, and we can record the manual gates. We can also record our loops. So there we go, recorded our rolls, excuse me. And we can also record our loops and just go completely crazy. So before I do that, I'm going to duplicate A to B so I have a safety net. And then I'm just going to loop the 3-bar pattern here. Oh, my record was not enabled. So I go to record. And now that recorded all of that data into my pattern. So as you can see, the effects fill section is super useful and really fun for live performance. I definitely recommend hanging out in the effects fill section and just really getting the hang of it, because this might be your most frequented page in the entire sequencer. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.